Okay. So we're up and running. So is there any questions that you guys want me to address before I jump into my notes for the reading? Okay. So again, we're re-engaging James Baldwin. Um, this is from the book The Fire Next Time. If you guys remember the video that we watched from last week of my visual storytelling, I was talking about this book explicitly. This book was originally published in 1962. Um, and as I mentioned in the video, I was given to this by my uncle when I turned 15. So if you think about the what's in the text, right? Baldwin writing to his nephew on his 15th birthday is exactly how I received the text as well. So a couple of things that stood out to me, even how the letter, because this is what it is, it's a letter, right? How it opens up. I begun this letter 5 times and tore it up 5 times, right? So you can tell there's somewhat of a tension at play. There's somewhat of a need for perfection, right, to communicate this the right way. But then also he says, I keep seeing your face, which is also your father's face and my brother, right? But then he likens his brother's face to his father or his nephew's grandfather, right? And he talks about on page 18 on the next page that how his father died. Now, for those who are familiar with Baldwin um, and his work, he has a book called Go Tell It on the Mountain, which is like his autobiography, if you will. It actually was turned into a movie. Is also, I want to say, in the early '80s, they adapted it into a movie. But you could see within that book the tension that he has with his father, and how his father was very emotionally abusive and verbally abusive. So you kind of see hints of that within this text, because he says, right, well, this is Baldwin talking about his father, his nephew's grandfather. Well, he is dead. He never saw you, and he had a terrible life. He was defeated long before he died because, at the bottom of his heart, he really believed what white people said about him, right? So this is what he's saying encapsulated his father and essentially led to his father's demise, right? He believed what the white world said about him. But then at the bottom of the paragraph, he issues a warning, right? You can only be destroyed by believing that you really are what the white world calls a nigger, right? And he's saying that's what destroyed his father and his nephew's grandfather, right? He believed the stereotypes, the myths, and the legends that the white world purported on him, right? And he took it as to be true of himself, which ultimately destroyed him. For me, so for next, which stood out to me, is on page 19. Let me see. I don't want to read all of it, but I want to read what's important. Okay, I'm gonna read 2 sections from page 19. I'm gonna start with the middle of the page here with a sentence that starts, "I know." Um, I know, and I know, which is much worse. And this, actually, let me go back. I know what the world has done to my brother, and how narrowly he has survived it. And I know, which is much worse, and this is the crime of which I accuse my countrymen, my country, and my countrymen, and for which neither I, nor time, nor history will ever forgive them. They have destroyed and are destroying hundreds of thousands of lives and do not know it and do not want to know it, right? So this is what he's charging against the United States and the people who are operating within the United States. So I'm going to go down to the bottom of page 19 with a sentence that starts, "But it is not," okay? But it is not permissible that the authors of devastation should also be innocent. It is the innocence which constitutes the crime, right? And to me, that explicitly speaks to a pillar of white inferiority that Baldwin talks about, right? Because you find it really in the end of that sentence. It is the innocence which constitutes the crime, right? So let's break that down. So he knows what the country did to attempt to destroy his brother, right? And he knows how narrowly his brother was able to escape those attempts, right? Then he says, it's not permissible, right? It's not okay that the authors of devastation, what does that mean? What does it mean to be the author of devastation?
Like the person that creates all the devastation.
Absolutely, right? So it's not okay that the creator of this devastation should also be innocent, right? That's a contradiction according to Baldwin, right? You can't go around causing all type of tragedies and terrors and destroying people's lives and then still be considered innocent, right? That doesn't line up. But this is where it gets very fecund. It is the innocence which constitutes the crime, right? So if we are to kind of understand that and break that down, Baldwin is saying, I'm not more so tripping off the devastation that you caused, right? In my eyes, that's not where the crime lies, in the devastation that you're the author of. But where the crime lies is your need to still try to be innocent, although you know that you caused all this devastation. Does that make sense? And this is what we mean when we say a pillar of white inferiority being the maintenance of white innocence, right? So even though that they went around the world on a tour of terror, they are still able to consider themselves innocent. And to Baldwin, that's a pillar that holds up this system of white supremacy or white inferiority, right? Um, okay. And then, right, so he has that claim. And then he goes with the counter argument. And we found the counter argument to that claim lower on page 20, right? And it's towards the middle of the page. And it says, I hear the chorus of the innocents screaming, no, this is not true. How bitter you are, right? But I am writing this letter to you to try to tell you something about how to handle them. For most of them do not really know that you exist, right? So again, we see the counter argument of, nah, you're bitter, right? This is not the case. This is not the American society. You're just bitter, right? But he says later for all that, I'm trying to tell you, James, my nephew, how to survive the encounter with them, right? This is what I need you to understand, right? And then he says, for most of them do not really know that you exist, right? But then he counters. They don't know that you exist, right? But I know the conditions under which you were born, for I was there. Your countrymen were not, and haven't made it yet. So they don't know about Harlem, right? So they're telling you that you're bitter, right? But they don't even understand the conditions of those who live in Harlem, right? I was there. I lived in Harlem. I grew up in Harlem too. So I know you. So I'm telling you this because I want you to avoid some of the pitfalls that I had to live through, right? So for your innocent countrymen to tell you or to tell me that I'm being bitter, they have no grounds to stand on because they don't even know what our life is like. They don't even know what the trials and tribulations that we have to go through on a daily basis, right? But I do. I was there, right? He says, your countrymen were not there and haven't made it yet. Your grandmother was also there, and no one has ever accused her of being bitter. I suggest that the innocents check with her. She isn't hard to find. Your countrymen don't know that she exists either, though she has been working for them all their lives, right? So again, if you want to say that I'm bitter, I'll give you that, even though I disagree. But talk to my mama, right? And you don't want to say that she's bitter because you know the time that she grew up in. You know that she was forced to work for you as a servant, right? So you know the atrocities that she had to go through occupying that role. But even though they won't say that she's bitter, but they still don't know her either, right? Even though she worked for them their entire life, they still don't know her. right? All they see her as is a servant, right? As a cook, right? But they don't know her real circumstances. They don't know what her life is. They don't know the ride home that she takes to get back to Harlem, right? So they don't know her either. Okay. And then on page 21, he says that this innocent country, this is on the I know your guys looks a little bit different, but this is the second paragraph on page 21. It says this innocent country set you down in a ghetto in which, in fact, it intended that you should perish. Let me spell out precisely what I mean by that. For the heart of the matter is here, in the root of my dispute with my country. You were born where you were born, and faced the future that you have faced because you were black and for no other reason. The limits of your ambition were, thus, expected to be set forever. You were born into a society which spelled out with brutal clarity and in as many ways as possible that you were a worthless human being. You were not expected to aspire to excellence. You were expected to make peace with mediocrity, right? It's a lot to unpack there. But how he starts off the paragraph, right? The innocent country sets you down in the ghetto with the intent for you to perish, right? They never intended for you to make it out of the ghetto, right? So for James Baldwin to come out of the Harlem ghetto in the 1920s and the 1930s to be able to travel to Paris, to be able to travel to Switzerland, right? That's beyond with the state, and I don't mean the state of California or the state of New York, with the government body institution, what we call the state, had intended for Baldwin, right? He exceeded their expectations because really what they intended for him was to perish in the ghetto and make peace with being mediocre, right? That's the intent of the ghetto project. You know that they also call the ghetto the projects, right? Are y'all familiar with that terminology? Think about what it means to be living in a project, right? They're working something out. It's an experiment taking place, right? This terminology is not happenstance. It's very intentional, okay? So the desire to make you comfortable with mediocrity, right? And you wonder for people who live in the projects, right? You know, why don't they move away? Why don't they move out? Why don't they just get jobs and better their circumstances, right? But Baldwin is telling you because the intention for this project is for you to be comfortable being mediocre, for you to accept being on welfare, and that's going to be the end of your income opportunities, right? To accept that as normal. That is the conditions that they place on people who occupy those spaces, right? Okay. And then, to me, there's a brilliant piece of advice that he gives him on page 22. He tells him to take no one's word for anything, including mine, right? Trust your own experiences. Know whence you came. If you know whence you came, there is really no limit where you can go. The details and symbols of your life have been deliberately constructed to make you believe what white people say about you. Please try to remember that what they believe, as well as what they do and cause you to endure, does not testify to your inferiority, but to their inhumanity and their fear, right? What is he saying? One, don't listen to nobody, not even me, right? But trust your experiences, right? Trust what you have gone through and let that guide your understanding of things, okay? And know where you came, know your history, right? Know your family's history, because that's going to allow you to ascend beyond that mediocrity that this ghetto is supposed to keep you within, right? Then he shifts the conversation a little bit. The details and symbols of your life have been deliberately constructed. So when you talk about these symbols and these details, right, think about stereotypes. Think about tropes. These are the symbols and the details that Baldwin's talking about, right? So if you think back to last week's lecture and how I articulated the white imagination, I said you really get to see the essence of the white imagination in Hollywood and the stereotypes that Hollywood produces about the black body, right? The black body is something to be feared. The black body is something that's threatening. That's the details and symbols that Baldwin's talking about, right? Black people being inherently inferior, right? Those are part of the symbols that Baldwin's talking about. He said they have been deliberately constructed to make you believe what white folks say about you, right? He says, but remember, what they believe, as well as what they say and what they do, and cause you to endure, it does not testify to your inferiority. What does he mean by it does not testify to your inferiority? What does it mean to testify? For those who've been to church and you want to testify, what does that mean? Or Baptist churches more particular.
Is it like speak on personal experience?
Yes, absolutely. So what he's saying is what they're saying, those symbols, those details, those stereotypes, right? They do not speak from experience, you being inferior. That does not equal that, right? But what it does testify to, what it does speak to, is their inhumanity and their fear. Y'all understand that? Right? So don't get caught up in that trap that killed your grandfather, right? Don't get caught up in believing that you are what the white world calls a nigger, right? Don't fall into that trap. But understand that they set that trap there because of their inhumanity and their fear, right? It's not an indictment on you. It's an indictment on the system that is at play. Does that make sense to you guys? This is what Baldwin's arguing, and this is what Baldwin's trying to infuse into his nephew at 15 years old, okay? Okay. And then so he starts to close it out, and he offers like somewhat of a resolution, if you will, for how to navigate this, right? And on the lower down on page 22, he says, there is no reason for you to try to become like white people. There is no basis whatever for their impediment assumption that they must accept you. The really terrible thing, old buddy, is that you must accept them. And I mean that very seriously. You must accept them and accept them with love, okay? Accept them with love. Keep that in the back of your mind. For these innocent people have no other hope. They are, in effect, still trapped in a history which they do not understand. And until they understand it, they cannot be released from it. So I'm going to work backwards in explaining what Baldwin's saying, okay? So this history that they don't understand. Think about last week's reading and think about the dynamics between Jesse and Otis, right? Jesse would go to Otis to ask him things about race because Otis had a little bit more knowledge about those matters, right? So that's an example of this history that white folks don't understand, right? This is what Baldwin's talking about. But then as we work our way up, he says we must accept them with love, right? Because they don't have any other hope because they don't understand history. Now, I want to articulate for you Baldwin's understanding or Baldwin's definition of love, right? It's not the romantic, fuzzy Disneyland prince and princess love that we've been conditioned to understand. Not the lovey, let's make light-skinned, curly-haired babies, right? Because we want to love the white folks in that capacity. No. Baldwin is talking about a love that unrests and disturbs, right? When Baldwin writes novels, he uses things like mirrors, reflections, windows, and waters as a metaphor to articulate the work that love should do, okay? Another famous quote from Baldwin is, if I love you, I must make you aware of the things you do not see, right? So for Baldwin, when he talks about love, it's an element of truth. there, right? It's an element of an uncomfortable truth, right? So when he says they're being trapped in a history that they don't understand, right? So for Baldwin, if we love them, right, I must make them understand that history. I have to show them the truth that they're uncomfortable with, right? Um, Love doesn't cater to your ego, right? It's not going to, Baldwin's love doesn't cater to your ego. It doesn't support the myth and the legends that you tell yourself about yourself, right? It tells you exactly how you are. Think about what a mirror does, right? We're about to go out for the evening, right? Enjoy your night out. You have an outfit that you put together in your head, right? The shirt matches the shoes, goes with the jeans, everything is spot on, it's perfect, right? But before you leave the house, you're gonna make sure that you do what? You check a mirror to make sure that how you think this outfit looks really looks the way that it does, right? So the mirror closes the gap between your perception of reality and reality, right? And Baldwin says that's what love should do. It's not going to tell you you look good when you don't, right? Love is going to tell you like, yo, your wig is crooked. You need to fix that motherfucker a little bit, right? Your shirt looks a little bit too small on you, bruh. Like you might want to go to a size large, right? So this is what the work that love and Baldwin's understanding should be doing, right? Um, okay. And then we'll end with this. So on page 23, I'm trying to think where to start the reading, kind of give you a full understanding. So he says, in this case, the danger in the minds of most white Americans is the loss of their identity. Try to imagine how you would feel if you woke up one morning to find the sun shining and all the stars aflame, right? So the sun is out and all the stars are lit up, right? That would disorient you, right? You would be frightened because it is out of order, is out of the order of nature. Any upheaval in the universe is terrifying because it so profoundly attacks one's sense of one's own reality. And this is what he's saying, that to do the work that love is supposed to do and show white folks true history, right, is going to put them in a space to where they're seeing the sun and the stars at the same time. It's going to disrupt their sense of identity, right? Because their imagination allows them to see themselves in a certain capacity, right? It allows them to see themselves as an element of superiority over others, right? That's what their imagination allows them to think. But if love does the work that love's supposed to do, it's going to let them realize that, you know what, you're no different, right? You have no innate superiority over anybody, right? You know that humans are the same. You know that the science of eugenics is bullshit. You guys know what eugenics is? Have you heard of that before? So eugenics is, have you heard of Darwin and Darwin's theory of evolution, right? So Darwin had this notion of survival of the fittest. So they took this notion and they applied it to human evolution. And they said that because of the size of someone's brain, they're inherently smarter than someone else, right? And they're able to classify racial superiority based on pseudoscience or false science that says whites are the most superior intellectually, physically, etc., followed by Asians, followed by those that occupy the indigenous community, and finishing with Africans, right? So this is the science of eugenics that classify racial superiority, right? So Baldwin is saying if love is to do the work that it's supposed to, it will let these people who believe in things like eugenics know that that's all a false notion, right? So again, knocking down these symbols and these legends that make one people feel superior and another group of people feel inferior, right? This is the work that Baldwin says love should really be able to do. So I will put my lecture on pause there. We'll open it up to group discussion and fishbowl. Remember, you have 2 fishbowls per semester. If you've done 2 already, you don't have to worry about going again. You have 1 time to pass. Is there anyone who wants to volunteer for the fishbowl?
I'd like to do it.
Okay, we had two people speak. I know Carolina and who else?
Kayla.
I'm sorry, who?
Kayla.
Kayla. Okay, gotcha. Thank you, Kayla.
I do too.
Alex, got you. All right, so we have Carolina, Kayla, and Alex. All right. So whoever wants to start, it's on you.
I can start.
Okay.
So, you brought up a point where you mentioned white fragility and how like white innocence, and I think I found an example of that when his uncle was saying, like you have to love the white man or accept him at least because he's stuck in the past. Doesn't that also uphold white innocence in a sense? That was just just something I noticed. But overall, I really like this reading. I feel like it comes from a sincere place, and you could definitely pick up on that while you're reading.
Good point, Carolina. I'll save my comments at the end. Who's next?
I could. Something I found interesting was like how you said as well, but in the reading of it's like you're not expected to aspire excellence. You're expected to make peace with mediocrity. It it kind of like brought to me because how they like how I don't want to say it, but like how black people are like in the projects and stuff, like how you were saying, they're they're just kind of expected to live off that way, live off the way they're showing in that area, you know.
Kayla, you ready?
Yeah. Reading the letter, I could sense James' protective and understanding stance he had over his nephew. Like he talks about the dangers and obstacles that James will face, but he makes sure to assure him that no matter what white men say, that he'll always be no less than what they make him to be or feel. Like he reminds him of the strong people he comes from by acknowledging the poets and the hard workers to put that sense of pride and strength into his nephew to continue to move forward, to get over any obstacles to do so. But he also makes sure that James understands the dangers of doing so because the country is stuck in the history and that they don't see anything wrong from, and the only way to move forward is to have them acknowledge the reality of what has been happening because the country is afraid of change and the consequences that will come with it.
Absolutely. So to kind of one of the things that Carolina said that really stuck out to me was the sincerity, and it's also mentioned in Kayla's not speech, but what Kayla said as well. And I think the sincerity that everyone is feeling, it really stems from it being a letter, right? And I think again, when you talk about method, you feel the sincerity, right? Even the deer, it adds an element of sincerity to it, right? Him starting the letter 5 times, it adds this layer of sincerity to it, right? Um, and then yes, this book is James speaking to his nephew James, right, and trying to advise him to avoid the trappings of the ghetto or the trappings of the project, right? But that project, right, that we call the ghetto, that's not an exclusive black experience, right? Everyone who is in the ghetto is part of that project, right? And as I look at the makeup of LA, and just because I'm more familiar with LA than I am with any other major city, um, the demographics of the projects has shifted, right? You look at Compton's projects, you look at Watts projects, Nickerson Gardens, right? There's more and more indigenous people starting to occupy those projects, right? So now they are being conditioned into the same experiences, right? So yes, in the 60s and within this context of the reading, it has a very black appeal to it, but this is a lot larger than just dealing with black folks. We do know that the first ghetto stems from Nazi Germany, right? They placed the Jews in the ghettos, right? So this project has very large global implications, but it has a particularity to it when it's manifested within the American context because of the way that we deal with race in the way that we do. Um, Another thing that Kayla is talking about that I kind of gleaned for her conversation explicitly is in a lot of my articulation of the notes, right? I talk about the critique. I talk about him trying to articulate the pitfalls of Americanism. But what I heard in Kayla's moment was the love that Baldwin articulates also, right? Because he says, it's the love that sustains you, because we were terrified when you were born, but we were able to make it through because of the love that we have for you. And it's going to be that love that you'll pass down to your children's children that will allow them to sustain themselves, right? So, yes, while he's talking about the ugliness and the realness of ghetto life, right? He's also very much attentive to the beauty and the love that's present in ghetto life, right? So, and I really heard that implicitly from what Kayla was saying. So thank you guys. That was a really good fishbowl. Let's open it up to broader classroom conversation. We have a couple of things that we could put on the table. We could talk about the distinction from method and going to meet the man and the method of this text that we just read. We could go in a little bit further about the pillars of white inferiority. We have Baldwin's concept of love on the table. So there's a lot of things that we could discuss, but I'm curious to hear from you guys, specifically people who we have not heard from yet.
I just wanted to mention that he said something. He said we cannot be free until they are free. And I feel like that's very important because I feel like it could be like it's like a white person problem that has consequences for people of color because like they know that it's there, but they choose to be ignorant about it, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I mean, so like I'm 37. So realistically, right, I could say I've been taking a very serious investigation of race for 20 years, right? And I came to the conclusion, I don't know, maybe about 5, 6 years ago, that the problem of racism, right, is by and large a white problem. But we just, and when I say we, I mean people of culture, we are forced to deal with the consequences of their problem. Does that make sense? Right?
Yeah, it does. That's like a simpler way to put it, basically.
Yeah. Right? Because at the end of the day, and another way to think about it, right? Rape, by and large, is a male problem, right? That's something that men have to work out, right? Women have to suffer the consequences of men's inability to deal with that problem, right? And to me, that's a parallel that we could draw, right? So just as men are the perpetrator of rape by and large, white folks are the perpetrator of racism by and large, right? So it's their problem. Rape is a man problem. Racism is a white folks problem, right? But the victims happen to be people of culture. The victims happen to be women, right? So if we really want to get to solving issues of rape, women can come together and talk about what to do all they want to, but if you really want to fix it, men need to address their shit, right? That's the only way that this is going to really get resolved, right? Because women could have all the things in play to how to deal with someone when trying to rape you, but to really stop it, we need to eradicate this need for men to overpower and self-determine what women can do, right? So that's what needs to be ironed out if you want to resolve the rape issue. Just the same with race, right? People of culture can organize, can study and do all the things in their power to try to combat racial onslaughts. But if you want to really eradicate racism, you have to bring white folks to the table and have to have them address it within themselves, right? That's the only way that this could get resolved. Over the past summer, because of the protests that were going on, just the turmoil that was going on in last summer, I found myself on several Zooms having these conversations about race, about power, about how to be anti-racist, right? And it was interesting because, like, for me, outside of being a professor, right, it's not my job to teach white folks how to deal with their racist shit, right? And if you could create a system of racism, you have the mental ability and the cognitive process to deconstruct it, right? If you could create something, then you could take it apart, right? So when I found myself on these Zoom meetings and I'm having, so for one, for example, was on reconciliation, South African apartheid, and American racism. That was the theme of the conversation. And unbeknownst to me, the majority of the people on the Zoom call were from like middle America, Wisconsin, Ohio, like these real middle America random places. And they're like, you know, soccer moms, housewives, like these real middle to upper class white women, right? And they're asking me questions like, well, professor, how do we handle this racism stuff? I'm like, well, lady, I don't answer that question because what I feel as someone, as a people who sat down, had conferences like the Berlin Conference to decide how we're going to divide up Africa. If you're really serious about resolving this race issue, you need to sit down, have a conference about how you can come over and overcome white privilege, right? And all these things that come along with with racism that you guys benefit from, right? So it's not on me to fix it. That's on y'all because y'all created it. And to me, that's what I'm gleaning from Trisha's comments, right? In a more expanded way. But this is what she's talking about. I'm just looking at the chat. Mm-hmm. Do you want to speak on this, Caitlin? Because I think it's a really good point.
Oh, so basically what I was saying is like we don't give enough credit. Well, not credit. I don't know if credit is the right word. We don't give enough responsibility to white people for the things that they've done. Basically, we like to play that, oh, we didn't know game. They know, like, if you go to school, like, even though they don't teach a whole bunch, like, about the things they've done, they know the sum of what they did. It's not like they don't know completely unless they live in Antarctica or something like that. I just think that I think that we like to play the whole I didn't know game, and really it's kind of like you do know what's going on. You have to have known what's going on and stuff like that. And even if you didn't know like the history, you know that shooting someone is wrong, or whatever the crime was, it was wrong. So like own up to that, atone to it. And it doesn't have to be personally you. It was someone who identifies as you, and it may have been someone in your family who did it, and you have to take responsibility and say, okay, this is what happened, and this is what I need to do to make it right or make it better.
Yeah. And I think, Kaylin, the lack of responsibility, it helps maintain and uphold the notion of white innocence, right? Because if you say you don't know, then I can't be held accountable for it and I could still remain innocent, right? To me, it's not, you're absolutely right? There's no way that you don't know. But if you want to play that route, yep. If you want to play, if you want to play that route, then at best you're willfully ignorant, right? Because all the resources are there for you to know, but you choose not to know because it benefits you to not know, right? And another way that I think that we allow them to escape responsibility is mental illness, right? And I have this debate with my lady all the time. It's like, man, they're like, because when the Karens was like going wild over the summer,
Hello, wild.
yeah, right, just bugging, right? And my lady's like, oh, it's a mental illness. I'm like, yeah, those are actions that exhibit mental illness, right? But at the same time, I think it's deeper than that. They've been socialized to believe that they can act this way, right? And to me, the mental illness kind of gives them a way out, right? Think about how they articulated the white boy who shot up that spa in Atlanta, in Georgia, right? mental illness. He was having a bad day, right? He has a sex addiction, and these locations he felt were a temptation, so that justified him going to shoot up all those people. The fuck? Like that don't even sound logical coming out of my own mouth, right? But they'll say these things to help maintain their innocence. It's a lot going on in the chat. Angelica, did you want to kind of speak on what you were saying?
Yeah, I was just agreeing that for the most part, they victimize themselves because they don't want to take responsibility of the actions that they have done or actions in the past. There's always the argument that, like, oh, that wasn't me, that was in the past, that was like my ancestors, that has nothing to do with me. But the whole thing is about responsibility and atoning for what has been done in the past, which has clearly not been done. And there's always, I've seen before that, like, oh, the Jews forgave the Germans for the Holocaust, and that I don't think that's necessarily true. But Germany actually took steps to
Hmm.
repair for what they did. They apologized, and I believe that they even paid money, and that really doesn't like um like make up for all the lives that were lost and everything that was done to them, but at least they acknowledge what they did was wrong, which isn't something that has been done in the U.S.
Yo, Kaylin, you was in my head. That was going to be literally my next statement. Please say that out loud, Kaylin. What you put in the chat?
If I'm not mistaken,
You're not.
even the U.S. gave money to the Jews. After that, they was like, here's it's like reparations and stuff for what they've been through. It
So
baffles me.
just to make sure that you're understanding what she said, okay? So we all know from history, right, that the conflict between the Jews and the Nazis that all took place on European soil, right, um, in sparking a world war, right, where the U.S. got involved as an ally to stop that world war and to stop the progression of Germany, right? So just to be historically accurate, right? So what the United States is doing and is still doing to this day, because of that, they're paying the state of Israel a form of reparations. Go online and look up how much money the U.S. is paying in how much money the U.S. is paying towards the Israeli Defense Fund, right? So how much money the U.S. sends to Israel to fortify their military defenses. Look that up online. Like, don't take my word for it. I want you guys to go look that up just so you can see the connection that's still at play between Israel and the United States, especially during the Obama era. He was probably one of the most financially friendly person to give money to Israel. Angelica, what did you find online? I've seen your face. Go ahead.
Uh, yeah, I just saw it. It was the first thing that popped up. In 2019, the U.S. provided $3.8 billion to Israel.
So when we talk about reparations, right, and they come up with all the excuses in the world as to how that's not feasible, how that's not practical, and how that cannot be done, we know that's bullshit, right? Because if you could come up with 3.9 billion to give to Israel and you had nothing to do with the atrocities that were caused on the Jews, but you are lockstep and key in this institution of enslavement and you can't come up with money to afford to African people, I gotta call Cap. Were you gonna say something, Kaylin?
I was just saying how baffled I was when I found that out. And also, it's kind of like they still have things like, what would I say, memorials and stuff like that, that and 9/11 and stuff like that. But when it comes to slavery, oh, let that go. But it's kind of like slavery lasted for hundreds of years. You know, you kidnap people, you had them work, you killed them, you you raped them, you did all this stuff to them. Then you went to their homes, you took everything, their resources and all that stuff, and then oh, let that go. But if it was 9/11, they still have their stuff. Even though it was a bad thing, I'm not saying that.
Right.
But what I'm saying that you shouldn't tell us to let that go if you won't let that, 9/11 go. It's coming.
Yeah, they
It's
had the sticker that says "Never forget 9/11," right? But
yeah.
get over racism now, right? Yeah, it's a contradiction. And to Angelica's point, looking at the chat, she says it still continues to this day. The effects still continue to this day. I'm thinking about the black and white wealth gap. So if you guys were paying attention during the presidential elections of this year, that was very much on the table for both Republican and Democratic candidates. How will you address the black white wealth gap, right? They say numerically and statistically by 2055, the median household incomes for black households will be zero. I'm gonna say that one more time. Statistically, by 2055, the median household income for black households will be zero. Okay? Now, flip side to that. If my great 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 grandfather, right, was able to become a millionaire due to the fact that he had a workforce that he did not pay, right? He dies, he passed that down to my great great grandfather, right? My great great grandfather does whatever he can to add on to the money that he accumulated that was, passed down to him. He dies, he passed the money down to my great grandfather, right? My great grandfather does what he can to accumulate more wealth. He dies, he passes that down to my grandfather, right? My grandfather does what he can do to add on to that wealth. He dies and passes that down to my father. My father does what he can to add on to that wealth. He dies, he passes that wealth down to me, right? I do what I can with that wealth to add on. I transition, I pass that on to my kids, right? So this is how white wealth gets maintained, right? And this is why there's a wealth gap between the black and white community, or really the white community and any other community that's not white, right? They have a 6th century head start financially, right? That's like you getting, if we're running the 400, I'm gonna let you run the 100, right? And then I get to start. That's the type of financial head start and financial cushion that they have. And to me, that's probably the biggest effect of enslavement that lasts till this day, right? Yeah, is what we don't have, but what they do have that they take for granted, right? Donald Trump considers himself someone who is self-made, right? But his business empire got started by his father's $500,000 loan. So how self-made is that? What would I or what would any of y'all be able to do with a $500,000 loan to start a business? How close to millionaires would y'all be at this moment, right? And you have the luxury to not only get a $500,000 head start, you could be a terrible businessman, right? How many bankruptcies does Donald Trump have for his businesses failing, right? But he's considered a successful businessman, right? This is what, when you talk about privilege, this is the material transitioning of privilege that we talk about, right? This is that gap. And this is where that gap stems from, the vestiges of enslavement. Other thoughts on the reading, or even what we're discussing? It's a lot for y'all. Yeah. 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 If y'all could only be in my head for 2 hours, it'd probably really fuck y'all up, man. All the stuff that just kind of really going into my head, I lose sleep at night sometimes, but it is what it is, right? And then I think too, and again, to kind of talk back to Kayla's fishbowl, right? We can't gloss over the love, right? And we can't miss that. And to me, another thing about this reading, and I'll go back to how I started my lecture, right? My uncle gave this to me when I turned 15. I'm gonna give this to my son when he turns 15. Hopefully, he gives this to his son when he turns 15. So this is not a letter just to Baldwin's son, to Baldwin's nephew James, right? It's a letter to all black nephews, It's a letter to all black sons, black grandsons, black sisters, black daughters, black nieces, right? All marginalized sons, nephews, all marginalized nieces, sisters, right? It's a letter to the downtrodden, right? It's the letter to the unrepresented, right? On how to survive this experiment, this project we called America. And that's why I say this is more than a letter, this is pedagogy, right? Do you guys know what I mean when I say pedagogy? So pedagogy is essentially is teaching how one informs instructions to another, right? So this letter is an instruction on how to live as a person of culture in America, right? And to me, that's the beauty of not only Baldwin, but that's the beauty of this book, of this text, right? It's an instruction manual. An instruction manual that you pass on at adolescence, right? And this ties directly to this notion of funds of knowledge, which is one of our theoretical frameworks, right? How knowledge gets passed down from generation to generation to generation. This is a prime example of that. Let's end with one more comment from somebody we haven't heard from today, and we'll call it a day. So we have Pamela, we have Denise, we have Zaria. I think everybody else we heard from though. So one of you guys, please.
Something that I wanted to add is that yes, I agree that it's like an instruction of how to live their life for the Black community. And I think that it's also, it's in a way, it's kind of like trying to show them how to not only survive but also thrive, because he tells them, you know, what's wrong, but like he also tells like what needs to change, you know, like what needs to change for them to not only survive but, you know, to like achieve that change, to be able to thrive, like just have a better life and like change the system.
Yeah. You're absolutely right, Natalia. The only thing I want to overemphasize, and I'm going to just overemphasize me overemphasizing this, right? Yes, it is written to his black nephew, but I have to assume, right, that for my indigenous students in the class, there's something that you guys walked away with this from this reading as well, right? I don't think that because he's speaking to his black nephew that this wasn't applicable to you guys in your experiences, right? And again, that's why I say it's a
Oh yeah, definitely.
yeah, it's pedagogy for all those who are oppressed, right? There's a book called by Frantz Fanon called "The Wretched of the Earth," right? And when he's talking about the wretched, he's talking about all people who are marginalized, all people who are oppressed, right? What we inaccurately call minorities, right? So this book is pedagogy for the wretched, right? Um, Something that was mentioned in the chat at the start of class, I want to re-articulate. Trisha mentioned that there's a documentary on Netflix by James Baldwin titled "I Am Not Your Negro." If you have some time over spring break, definitely check it out. It's a great documentary. It's compiled from this book, and there's another collection of essays that Baldwin published titled "No Name in the Street." And those two books make up the documentary "I Am Not Your Negro." I believe it's on Netflix as well as Hulu. Maybe not. No, I'm sorry, not Hulu. It's on Netflix and Amazon Prime. So if you guys can, please take some time to watch that. It's entertaining and it really gives you a temporal assessment of what was going on in Baldwin's time, right? And it will really give you insight into our next section. So when we get done with the midterms, we'll start going into like Black Power. We'll go into Malcolm X. We'll go into Martin Luther King. So it will kind of prep you for that moment in time in our history. So if you can, check that out. The only homework I have for you guys is to do something to take care of yourself, right? Find a way to self-heal. Find a way to a healthy way to self-medicate. That could sound wrong. But do something to, fortify yourself. We've been going through a lot, right? This pandemic isn't gone. All the other bullshit that America will put you through, right? And we're still trying to be scholars and be academics. Take this time to heal yourself, man. Take some time to do some spiritual work. Sit in silence, sit in thoughts. try to do some meditation, right? Yes, yes. Just looking at the chat. Sorry, y'all. Other than that, is there any questions you guys have for me? All right. We'll call it a day.